Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening for this event. My name is Aska Hisa, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at ICALA. We're pleased to present this art talk between artist Sara Cwynar and Jamillah James, former Senior Curator of ICALA and organizer of the current exhibition titled Sara Cwynar, Apple Red, Grass Green, Sky Blue. We actually pre-recorded this conversation as Sara is based in New York and Jamillah is now the Manilow Senior Curator at MCA Chicago. We are, however, providing live ASL interpretation with Kim Diez. Thank you, Kim. This program will be a little over an hour as we have edited in images and some excerpts of all of the videos that are on view currently at ICALA. There will be no Q&A. There is a publication titled Glass Life produced by Aperture, and it is an incredibly popular publication, but you can buy it at ICALA or on our website. I'd like to read a little bit about Sara Cwynar. Sara was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. She holds an MFA from Yale University and a Bachelor of Design from York University in Toronto, Canada. Sara studied English literature at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Select solo exhibitions include Sara Cwynar, Gilded Age at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Ridgefield, Connecticut, Image Model Muse, the Milwaukee Museum of Art in Wisconsin, the Minneapolis Institute of Art in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Tracy from Oakville Galleries in Oakville, Ontario, Canada, Soft Film, MMK Museum für Moderne Kunst in Frankfurt, Germany, and she has participated in group exhibitions, including the 33rd Bienal de Sao Paulo in Brazil, Subjektiv, Malmö Kunsthall in Sweden. You are looking at something that never occurred in Zublodowicz collection, London, in the UK, and Greater New York at MoMA PS1 in Queens, New York. In 2019, the Museum of Modern Art in New York commissioned Cwynar to make a series of film to stream on the museum's website and social media platforms. Cwynar's works are in such esteemed permanent collections as the Guggenheim Museum, MoMA, MMK Museum für Moderne Kunst in Frankfurt, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Centre Pompidou in Paris, Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Dallas Museum of Art, Milwaukee Art Museum, Fondazione Prada in Milan, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City, and the Foam Photography Museum in Amsterdam. Sara Cwynar, Apple Red, Grass Green, Sky Blue is on view at ICALA until May 29 of this year. Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to now switch over to sharing my screen so that you can watch this wonderful conversation between Sara and Jamillah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamillah James. I'm the former Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and now the current Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. And it is my pleasure and privilege to speak with Sara Cwynar today about our exhibition on view at the ICALA through May 29th, Apple Red, Grass Green, Sky Blue. Sara, it's so nice to see you. I saw you in the last 48 hours. I was in Los Angeles before heading to Chicago, so it's really nice to see you, albeit in a virtual format, to talk about the show and specifically talk about the works that are on view in the exhibition and pack them a little bit for people that are watching this talk. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the ways in which your work has been contextualized. Often in conversation, you as a person working conceptually with photography and with moving image, oftentimes the history of the pictures generation is evoked as you being a part of the next generation of those artists who are investigating power and the problems of the world of images through images and text. Though I also think about your work in conversation with the constructed photography of the Vancouver School of Photographers, which is closer to home, being that you were born in Vancouver and studied at York and Toronto. So I wanted to talk about, just to give a little bit of a groundwork for some of the stakes of your work. In your training, who were some of the artists that you were looking at, and how did you begin working as a photographer?
Yeah, I mean, I was a graphic designer first, which I think makes sense. But about halfway through design school, I started wanting to be a photographer, but I had already dropped out of school like 3 times, so I couldn't switch. Um, so my first kind of forays into art were really through design and making books and kind of accumulating information and then turning them into something else. So I made this book, Kitchen Encyclopedia, really early on that kind of aggregated images under different categories and then represents them to sort of say something new. And I don't think I even knew about the pictures generation yet then. At that time, I was really looking at Gregory Crutzen and Gursky and Jeff Wall, and I thought, like, to be a photographer, you have to have a big crew and make a very high production value thing, and that's not something I can do. And then really when kind of more studio photographers, like quite a bit later, like Lucas Blaylock, I think of, or Annette Kalm, Leslie Hewitt, for example, or Moira Davey, also someone whose work I saw really early on. Those were the artists where for the first time I kind of thought, oh, I could do this, and it can be a sort of economy of means type art practice, and it doesn't have to be this like enormous production every time. But I really came,
or an enormous image also. I mean, thinking about Jeff
yeah,
Wall in particular, or Gursky in particular, like the vastness of the image that they're producing.
yeah. Yeah, like in undergrad once tried to make a light box and was like, this is impossible. And it later realized, of course, Jeff Wall probably doesn't actually make any of his own light boxes. And the whole point is that they're these like industrial materials, but yeah.
Yeah, the different hands that are involved in the production of an art object. Jeff Wall is not making his own light boxes for sure, but there's a lot of other people that are brought into the production of the images, which can be said the same for you, especially with the more recent photographs and the videos, which we'll get to in a little bit. I'm happy that you brought up Kitchen Encyclopedia, because I think seeing a copy of that was maybe the first time that I had encountered your work. And I know that the artist's book is very important to photographers as another means of circulating images. But in Kitchen Encyclopedia, you're also including writings by yourself, Milan Kundera, Baudrillard, and Roland Barthes about the idea of kitsch, which is a shorthand term for art and objects that perhaps are naive or banal or earnest or have a feel-good quality to them. There's that hierarchy of high and low that comes into play with talking about kitsch. And we'll get a little bit deeper into the films that are on view in the exhibition shortly, but I'm wondering, because there are these moments in those films, like the subject, that ground the video, such as the rose gold iPhone or the soft velveteen jewelry box, then there's this continued engagement with objects that have affective qualities that inspire some kind of feeling in us. And I'm wondering, since there's been some distance, almost 10 years since you put out Kitsch Encyclopedia, I'm wondering how actively you're still thinking about kitsch in the present.
Yeah, I mean, I think it still applies to a lot of the things I'm working with. Like early on, my interest in particularly Milan Kundera's definition of kitsch was this idea of like the sort of things that we look at in order to ignore everything that we don't want to look at or that's uncomfortable or in his book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, he's talking about death, like that ultimately life ends in death, and that we live in these kind of failing or fallible bodies, and that we're just scrambling around trying to ignore that by making all these pictures. Or I mean, he has a broader definition of, I guess, images, which includes like political movements or religion or idealized advertising, or all these different sorts of things that we kind of live in instead of our actual lives in order to make things more palatable. And I think that still applies to most of the materials that I'm working with in some degree. And then also, I guess, over the years, I've gotten more deeply into the way that we kind of construct alternate versions of the world using the images that are available to us, or how we're all kind of collaging our own opinions and our own versions of reality from the materials that come at us through our media and through our kind of historical images, and how to kind of wedge any sort of understanding into that space, or how to kind of make any sense of it. Yeah, and then the Kitsch book was also like a mode of working that kind of has continued to follow me. Like the films have just become that, but exploded, sort of making these epic documents of 500 pages of text, and then like whittling them down to 9-minute or 18-minute films. Like the kind of things that float to the top in that type of making is, I think, sort of an analogy to the way that some images float to the top and others disappear, and there's kind of a randomness to that, but that's also so key to the way that we understand the world.
Yeah, that sifting of information, kind of sorting out what's useful, what's pleasurable, what's soothing, what's calming, anything to kind of avoid the inevitable, something that's a barrier between ourselves and, the forward trajectory of time and history, I think is an interesting conceit. And it's something that, does come up in the work. Planned obsolescence is something that figures into the work at times, but also this, rejection of, the world of objects, like objects outliving their use values shifting and changing over time, how that can be extended to the human condition as well, and specifically the lived experience of being a woman, femininity, all these things that are prescribed to us and repackaged and advertised and used against our better judgment and better wishes. So in soft film, which is the earliest film that's in the show, and the first one, I'm curious about the transition from making photographs where you can be sorting through and your particular your archive of images that you've amassed, but extending that to the world of objects and making, a durational work like a film.
Yeah, I mean, I made soft film in a very frustrated state. Like, I felt like the photographs were kind of being read as too stuck in their aesthetic pleasure or something. And I have always done so much research, and like so much thinking goes into each photograph. But I mean, part of the point is that it looks like this kind of other thing that exists in a world that might be more simplified. Like often they look like advertising images, as I think you mentioned. But yeah, like making film was a way to literally talk and sort of kind of ease this insecurity I had about being misunderstood in my own work, which I think is like not really doesn't seem like a problem to me anymore. And of course you're going to be misunderstood, and if you can be understood, you're probably making bad work. But it was also kind of like a generative like hang up or trip I was on or something at the time. So I made soft film around the object of the jewelry box, and I was trying to kind of answer several questions. One was like, why do I care about these kind of slightly obsolete objects, which is a question I still can't answer, but trying to get at like why certain things seem important to some people and seem like they mean nothing to others. And in particular, I was looking a lot at the context of eBay, which really demonstrates that, like, with the value that one person would place on a jewelry box versus another. And yeah, it's like very endlessly fascinating to look at the kind of arbitrariness of that, and it just kind of evokes the arbitrariness of all value, I guess. But
It's the
and
associations that people can make through an object. And sometimes those are of nostalgic reasons or personal reasons. I mean, going to thrift stores, looking at eBay, it never ceases to blow my mind when someone gives away their personal photographs. Like,
yeah,
how
it's
does that
crazy.
break happen where you
Mhm.
just completely disassociate from, something that seems to be personal?
Yeah, yeah, and like, why does that seem to matter so much to me or you? And some people have no connection to photographs or don't understand why anyone would keep them. And I think those are kind of unanswerable questions, but the film sort of comes at trying to consider what value is and where it comes from. And I was reading a lot of cultural anthropology at the time, and like texts about material culture and how value gets constructed, but none of it was really answering the question. And then I was also thinking about sort of how the way that we value objects can have bearing on the way that we value each other, and how the kind of constant cycles of wanting and then discarding objects um, have some kind of repercussions in, our relationships to each other, and sort of using the object to talk about more specifically like political things that don't have anything to do with that object. And it was also about this term soft misogyny that was in the news at the time, which was originally around this woman, Ellen Pao, who was suing this corporate firm that she worked for kind of subtle forms of discrimination, like not being invited to the office drinks or being asked about her pet instead of what she was doing at work, or these things that you can't quite put your finger on but that are happening, and how you can even talk about that. And maybe it's through something kind of so random as a jewelry box or an object.
Yeah, I was really struck by this idea of soft sexism or soft misogyny, which is a term that I hadn't heard before. But then in reading, your texts and interviews about this piece and thinking of how we upholster over issues like power dynamics or the forces of sexism and discrimination in softer material so that it's more palatable or it's something that can be easily ignored was a very interesting idea. And bringing it to something as banal as a velveteen jewelry box and having that be like the locus that opens up this broader conversation about these more complex social issues that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard that term before that moment, and I was like, oh, this is the perfect term. I mean, I also made it in grad school, and it's like such a angry grad school feminist film in a way. But yeah, I think, and I also was thinking a lot about like speaking to an audience that might already agree with you, or speaking to someone who might like just shut off as soon as you talk about feminism, which happens a lot for sure, and how
Yeah.
to make something that was so kind of pleasurable that it could sort of transcend whatever specific politics I was talking about, but that also sort of contained the stakes of specific personal politics, so that it wasn't like this object lesson. Like, the film could have very easily been just about things and the sort of pleasure of fading things, but I sort of knew that wouldn't be enough.
Soft
Surrealism.
misogyny.
The everyday surrealism of
The
thrown away
texture is here
objects.
right in front of me, but can I convey it to you?
How does design
What can you do
fail?
with no time and no money?
How do things become a glitch instead of an intention?
What is that, pamphlet-sets?
A palimpsest.
Palimpsest.
As
Pamphlet-sets.
of objects, the way you can control them.
I will only mention a couple other men here. I will steal their
The
thoughts
information
like I
a
do my
photo
pictures.
carries sits on its surface
and
and not within its body.
Palimpsest.
Look at this beautiful presidential bust.
I accept
Grey
everything
comb
under city bench. A soft misogyny. There are these Nike shoes I got. I build them on a website. Then they appear to me in real life 6 weeks later. Is there a better alchemy than that? But they are pudgier and puffier than they were in the picture, too plasticky, the wrong shade, like a pair of hands in another set of photographs I found. Who was this man? How did he get that scar on his upper right hand? The eBay boxes often smell like cigarettes when you open them. So I comb eBay. Of course I can't sleep. There was too much to look at. An impulse to buy because this object truly is one of a kind. The inalienable object, Picasso or a family heirloom.
And then you ramp up the stakes by appearing in the work, which at that point you weren't appearing in your photography, but soft film is an instance where you are in the work itself. And, you know, there's various things that are happening, like your body's being concealed or you're reclining and not necessarily doing direct address to the camera, but your very presence there, you know, connects it into the world of the real. And I was wondering why you felt it was a necessary gesture, not to just rely on the things and the progression of images and the voiceover, but to actually put your body in the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the reasons you just described, like, it just didn't seem like enough without myself in it, and I didn't understand enough what someone else's image would do to cast anybody else. Like, I've since photographed only a few other people who aren't myself. My friend Tracy, who I've known since before I made the Kitchen Encyclopedia book, like I've known her for a long, long time. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable photographing her. And then I photographed models who, for better or worse, function sort of like objects. I mean, maybe that's a bad thing to say, but, and my work is like sort of trying to get around that, but in the way that models kind of are taught to pose, it's not quite the same as photographing a non-model person or putting yourself in it.
I mean, a model is constructing, is a construction in and of itself. I mean, they're walking, they're presenting, they're doing all of these gestures that, you know, are to invite people to purchase something or to look at something. Their movements through the world are very different than your movements or my movements or Tracy's movements even.
Yeah, like it's a lot more comfortable to photograph a model, which is why I'm usually not interested in it. But I guess I'll just segue into some pictures of these models from essence.com, which is the kind of one of the earlier e-com websites that sort of functions like this giant archive. Like they have, I guess actually thousands now of photographs of kind of everything in this middle tier of fashion that's come out since the website started, and they photograph everything in the same 3 kind of repetitive gestures, and the models essentially look like robots. And I was working with some of those models and getting them in my studio and kind of trying to take different sorts of pictures of them. And some of those models appear in Glass Life and are in later video works too. But I was really fascinated with the kind of standardization, I guess, of these actual people within this space, and also thinking about the kind of different sorts of archives that come about because of the internet, like these random clothing sites that we'll probably never go back and look at again, but that have created these like massive repositories of one specific thing, always photographed in the same way, and that kind of depersonalizes everything.
Yeah, and really just standardizes how we think about fashion. Like how you'll see, you know, if you're on Instagram, you know, you might get an advertisement for Essence, but then there'll be like 10 other clothing stores that are of a similar aesthetic. And it just keeps cycling out of control, and everyone kind of looks the same. We almost question whether or not, you know, these are actual people or if this is just, you know, some kind of representation, because, you know, the work that they're doing is a representation of a certain ideal. The Essence photos follow the Tracy series of works. You did a couple of photos for their website with the models wearing Miu Miu's fall 2019 season of clothing. And I'm wondering about how comfortably you sit in working directly in the lens of fashion photography at the intersection of advertising and fashion and the fashion and beauty industries. I mean, working inside of it and doing a photo shoot of this nature using the visual language that you do in your own work is a form of critique. Though I'm curious about how, in an instance like that, you would maintain some distance and push against, the possible consumption of your own aesthetic into, this mill of images that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, with the Essence pictures were actually me and Tracy in the Miu Miu clothes.
Yes.
Oh yeah. I think it was clear that from the photos that we're kind of making fun of it, but that also that's getting used by Essence. Like they are comfortable with that level of critique and kind of probably knew they were going to get it. And I feel like a kind of making fun of fashion photograph or a fashion photograph that shows the seams has just become absorbed into recent trends of fashion photography. That particular shoot I just decided to do because it sounded fun and I wanted the Miu Miu clothes. Like I thought that the Miu Miu clothes could be used in something else. I was actually really into the fact that they had made these like really ruffly dresses out of camouflage and how much of an obvious kind of contradiction that was within the dresses and coats. But I've actually said no to almost every fashion job I've ever been offered, but everybody thinks, I mean, I'm not saying you think that, but a lot of people seem to think that I work in fashion all the time. But
Yeah.
actually I just kind of use the aesthetics of it. But I do think it's kind of the same question with participating in the art world. Like you're within this structure that you're trying to critique. I feel like a majority of artwork has some critique of capitalism within it in some way, and yet we're often selling our work to some of the biggest capitalists in the world, if we're lucky, I guess, or in some version of lucky. But yeah, I don't know how to square that. I mean, I think a lot of the content of my work is like how to make sense of something from within it and how to kind of take some pleasure in the forces that we of gross capitalism that we have to live in, while also seeing what it's doing, and then sort of larger ways that we kind of accept things that we know are bad for us so that we can continue on in circumstances that aren't ideal or that are outside of our control, which is also a lot of the reason why Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism book has been so inspiring to me, as I know it has to a lot of artists, because she really like hits the nail on the head with that, like how you kind of continue to accept these smaller pleasures in order to kind of stay connected to the world and stay kind of thrown into the world and keep moving forward, even while the things that you're kind of doing on a day-to-day basis to find pleasure might be holding you back from making any real changes or from kind of escaping smaller cycles of working and consuming and staying stuck in the same places. So that's kind of a tangential answer, but I guess I feel like it's complicated, and it's one of the big questions of my work, like trying to absorb all these aesthetics and markers of different values and of fashion and of like also art history or things that we value in art, in like valuable historical art, and then regurgitate those and represent them without just kind of redoing the same thing I'm critiquing. And I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, it's a constant cycle of flattening and then representation and re-representation, and just trying to stay ahead of this cycle, this constant cycle of consumption, and the way that our image culture is now. Images circulate so much faster. Everyone fancies themselves a photographer, and it makes it a very complicated landscape to work within. So I'm glad that you brought up the Lauren Berlant and Cruel Optimism, because it serves as a framing device for the content of Rose Gold, which is another work that's on view in the exhibition, which starts with the release of the Rose Gold iPhone and goes into vintage melamine dinnerware, and then delves into this endless cycle of obsolescence, desire, labor, and consumption, objects as sources of comfort, sublimation, and projection. The film is a critical object and color study, but is also an articulation of how objects can choreograph our everyday, in particular, the ways that the iPhone has changed the way that we gesture in the world. And there's a direct connection between this object and the body. And in this work, you appear again, but there's some interesting things that are happening in the span of the film, where there's this connection to your body. There's a use of the first person voice, which is interesting and is quite explicit in this work. So I'm wondering, do you conceive of Rose Gold as more personal, or a form of biography or self-portraiture in a way through objects?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before, actually. I think I may not have at the time, but looking back, it probably is that. Like, I felt really personally stuck at the time that I was making it, and it's a very emo film. Like, I think when we were watching it within the show, I was like, wow, this is so emo. Like, I didn't remember it being that kind of sad. And yeah, I think at the time I was like trying to talk about kind of the things that Lauren Berlant also describes, like feeling stuck, feeling like your ways out sort of just reinforce the same cycles of exhaustion, and but also then that there are these like little things to grasp for, like buying a new phone in the same color that you, or in a different color than the one that you already have, and kind of giving into the pleasure of that, and how that's good too. And yeah, the film also touches on how kind of things that were made with great optimism faded from use, like the melamine plastic cups, which was this kind of indestructible type of plastic, or marketed as indestructible, from the 50s and 60s, produced by this company, American Cyanamid, that was kind of like a mid-century classic American conglomerate that also made fertilizer and entire suburbs, and then made all these plastics. And these things felt really like precursors for Apple, or for the kind of mega companies that we now look to sometimes for guidance, or at least for kind of desire and things to desire now. And yeah, it all felt depressing and sad, but also like there was a little bit of joy in it too. So I guess that those are really personal feelings. And yeah, but I was surprised by how emotional it is watching it again, because I kind of made it in a very quick, like fugue state through. I made the first version of it in 3 weeks, and then didn't look at it again for a year, and then re-edited it. So
They invented this color, rose gold, and I'm mesmerized. A new object of desire. I totally fell for it. It's almost embarrassing enough to blush. There was a time when we were able to draw up an encyclopedia, an exhaustive catalog of all the objects in the world. Since then, everyday objects, every possession is an extension of the self. My world is fragile.
One gesture away from losing all access to sustaining the fantasies I need.
What is a good life when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your The name of a color is the result of a segmenting between other colors.
orange
and
between
new
red
colors
and
for
yellow.
old things. I hear that the gold iPhone was for the Chinese market, where gold still really means something.
Art Nouveau exploded.
I
They keep finding watch advertisements where all the clocks are set to
I read wise
8:20.
terms like Anna Digi. Well, new old terms. What time was it really? I go to check what time the Apple Watch is set to. I find myself wanting one. What kind of
Material
person
feel
am
of
I?
a year or an age.
Intuition is the work of history translated through personal memory.
But
How much can you
do I
fit
really
in the
need
cloud?
to remember?
You forget when you learn to use your inside voice.
When did you learn to
A
swipe?
red gold called
Arius
Arius
in
in
Greek.
Greek. And rose revolutions.
Easier for the
Ukraine was
West to
orange,
digest.
pink, lemon, or tulip. In every
Kyrgyzstan.
political gesture associated with democracy was branded with a color. Several male artists I know have told me that I am having a moment.
As if the moment will pass soon.
Rose Gold is having a moment too. Things travel to their destinations. What is the right way to talk about something? Do people understand more if you communicate through things bought and sold? I keep buying these plastics called melamine, evergreen, corsage. I find blue rose too. Royal, yellow rose, red. Why is mustard 1970? Melamine was mass-produced as colorful by a corporation called American Cyanamid. This product was marketed as indestructible. Cyanamid was the sole producer of buttons for U.S. military clothing. Part of the reason they fell out of favor was that they stained and faded with
Seafoam
use, stone
green,
gray,
copper
stained
rose.
brown from coffee and
I think
soup. About repetition. He tells me that optimism is the force that moves you out of yourself in order to be closer to satisfying something that you can't generate on your own.
I
know full well you would do anything. It's the wanting, not the having. Same with people as in objects. Rose gold doesn't need to be anything at all. Just an idea in the
something to
air.
look forward to.
A kind of metabolism of the object. The desire to have some impact on the world in relation to its impact on me. The cardinal theme of advertising. So this is a bird, and this is a bird, and this is a mouse, and this is a mouse. This is a tree, and so is that. This is rose, and this is gold. What do words have to do with anything? Or pictures, for that matter. And something else. I love the rose gold.
Old
iPhone.
divisions between people and things are confused in this magical object.
Out on the border between Arizona and Nevada, operated by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, style Art Deco, opening date 1936. Rose gold is flattering to most skin tones. Rachel, dark, dark. Who is and dark, what is dark, Rachel? Dark? Who is the voice of authority here?
And who is this object actually for?
Yeah, there's a quick succession between soft film in 2016, rose gold in 2017, and red film in 2018. And as I understand your process for assembling the scripts for these works, it's pretty time intensive. So can you walk us through a bit, particularly for Rose Gold, what came first? Was it the encounter with the Berlant text, the iPhone's emergence? Were you already writing and thinking about, the melamine, the Hoover Dam, all of these touch points that are in the film? And then when you start shooting, like, how do you stage these so that, you arrive at the finished work?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated. And I think there's also something personal in like creating this kind of insurmountable task for yourself and then, having this thing that you feel like you have to do. I think Last Life was that times 10 later. Like it was kind of my like COVID opus film that was all I did for a year. But for Rose Gold, I think I read the Berlant in the summer before I made the film, and then I made the film in the fall, and the Rose Gold iPhone came out in the fall, I think. And I remember when the Rose Gold iPhone came out, I was like, wow, this object was made for me. Like it has everything I could want in an object. It has like all the strange associations that we make about colors. It kind of is a way to talk about how color contains meaning and history. And then kind of in an ancillary way, how all these markers of like surface or color or shape kind of mean things that we aren't maybe able to access when we just look at them quickly in our everyday lives, which was also something that's part of the content of the film. and yeah, but then especially the thing I mentioned about the rose gold iPhone being kind of this like thing to throw your desire into, even though you know you'll spend money that you don't need to spend, and even though you already have it. And so I started kind of compiling text, a lot of the Berlant, and then like researching other things that came up while I was reading her text, and just compiling this like massive document, and then kind of writing my own thoughts in between those things, and then also compiling tons of advertising copy. I was really interested also in the kind of neo like modernism of Apple's advertising, and how it's kind of this anachronistic mid-century optimism style. I think that they're starting to change that, but at that time it was very much like, this is the greatest thing ever and this is the thing to end all things.
I mean, thinking about the presentations that, you know, Steve Jobs would make, where it's just this big dramatic presentation, and they're talking about a phone.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And like, they know better than anyone that nobody's gonna want that phone anymore, or even be able to operate it anymore within 2 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's I guess also, and this is something that interests me about a lot of the material I work with, like the kind of like bad faith of the advertising, but not even a malicious bad faith, like just a like, we all know this isn't true. So I mean, so many things in our world operate in this realm where where it's like talking to you or interpolating you or whatever you would say in this way that's like, you know, this isn't true, we know this isn't true, but we're all gonna say it because there's some pleasure in it, and you'll still want to buy it anyway, or we can't say the thing we're really saying, or I felt like that was an object to kind of start to dig into some of those, like the meanings that are underpinning what you're actually reading or seeing on a screen or on an advertisement. Yeah, and then I had wanted to talk about melamine. I think I had been researching it. I had made a project before that featured it, but that really felt like some sort of like NPR documentary, like, here's this crazy object that used to exist and this company made it, and just felt like a kind of expose, or like it didn't need to be an artwork. So the kind of connection between those things allowed it to become something else, and then gave me space to make it into this kind of more biographical project. And I think that way of like shifting between theory and the personal continues to be a kind of structuring method for all my film work.
So let's talk about Red Film, which is the film that follows Rose Gold. It's also about color and how our lived experience is further conscripted by capitalism, beauty, and gender, though it's also about art history and representation. There's a few points of distinction in this work. There's more direct address. You're suspended upside down. There's upright speaking. There's several featured participants, which is unusual. There's more repetition, but there's also moments of openness or silence from speaking. In the progression of these three films, what were some of the objectives that you wanted to achieve with Red Film that weren't present or possible with Soft Film or Rose Gold?
Yeah, I mean, when I started making Red Film, I thought it was going to be so different than the other two, and it sort of is, but it sort of isn't. I guess I really wanted to try working with other actors, and in the end, so I hired these dancers in Toronto where I was working at the time, and I had them make this whole choreographic sequence, and I had costumes made, and then in the end they occupy like 10 seconds of the film, where they're only there very, very briefly. I just couldn't quite figure out like what a bunch of other people mean within the context of the work, or like why they needed to be there, I guess. And so it started off as one thing, which was supposed to be this kind of almost dance film, and then it became something totally different. And I also wanted to use this idea that I had shot a film with, again, like a long time before, of being upside down, but then flipping it so it kind of looks right, but you can tell something's wrong, and your kind of inner body is like pressing on the outside of your body the way that it does when you're upside down, and it starts to look sort of increasingly painful and untenable over time, which is sort of the feeling the film has. Like it's building to this, I guess, kind of crescendo of things circling and looping and not being able to kind of put your finger on anything true or real within that space, which was also a kind of personal thing that I was feeling at the time, but that I wanted to be able to talk about through other objects. And so, yeah, in the end, the film kind of uses the upside down footage, but also incorporates all these other things like a Rubens painting at the AGO Museum in Toronto, and this old sports car that I got in a photo studio and shot. And it kind of became more about how the like markers of value in one space get recycled and regurgitated in another, and how we kind of feel like we have all these choices, but they're all sort of predetermined and they don't really feel like choices at all. But then there are actual people and bodies within these spaces, and like maybe being your actual self is a way out of that. But people have all sorts of different interpretations of its meaning, and what all those things do together.
Yeah, I would say your presence, and especially the moments where you're suspended, introduces this very strange tension into it, because there's all this, the dancers are moving, there's the Rubens, there's the red convertible, which is, when I look at the film, I'm like, oh my goodness, like how did you get that?
It was very hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine. But in looking at you in the work, there's pain that's palpable from being suspended and talking, and you can see it in your eyes, but I know that that's not the focal point, or necessarily the focal point, because there's all this other stuff going on in the background.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I wish I made, or I still could make, but just a film of that. And I mean, there are always like 25 other films that each film was supposed to be before it ends up being anything. But one of them was supposed to be this kind of like durational hanging upside down film, which ultimately I thought was just kind of like rehashing some 70s like art that I didn't really need to revisit, but where it keeps getting crazier and crazier as time goes on, and more uncomfortable. But I didn't quite know, like, I think that's part of it, and the kind of like, I guess the level of discomfort that we'll go through to kind of maintain physical appearances was something that the other aspects sort of bring in as well, or the way that we kind of make an image of ourselves in online worlds, for example. Although I don't think the video is that much about online worlds or it is, but it's about a lot of other things too. But it was thinking about also how we kind of like recreate ourselves according to images we've already made of ourselves, and according to feedback that we're getting all the time, and the kind of levels that we will go to maintain those functions, I guess, or to keep that working, which goes back to some of the themes of Rose Gold too. And in Red Film was the first time I used music as well. Like that was a big thing. I had kind of refused to use music before. I thought it was too emotionally manipulative, and that like the way that music often gets used in film just locks down the meaning too much. But in the end, I really liked playing with that and kind of making it super emo when the car comes in, and then and the kind of like incongruity of the emotional part being the red sports car part.
task. Okay. I'm talking about American patterns.
And French painters.
And French painters.
Cézanne.
Cézanne, Susan. I'm talking about the new woman, and a pattern which was invisible to the subjects when they lived it. I'm talking about the face. We've seen it all before. A loop.
A loop.
My mobile body makes a difference in the visible world. Who is at the center of vision here? For whom does the world simply open up? All the ideas must be apprehended in a single stroke, and a new image comes with no warning. And don't we all make everything just for one person? Just for one or two? I make it for you.
Right? As
we begin to traverse the field of vision, the tragedy of our partial knowledge lies behind us. Right?
I wanted to talk about your performance for Performa, because I think that the structure of Red Film predicts elements of the performance, which is called Down at the Arcade, that was staged at the former Top Shop in Midtown. And there's movement in the work and a structural connection to the site, as well as your in-studio practice being made visible, like the apparatus of your work made more visible. Before we talk about, move on and talk about Glass Life, I wanted to ask about the production of Down at the Arcade, and how producing a work for live performance presented new ideas or challenges, or opportunities for future videos or performances.
Yeah, I mean, it was very stressful, but it's something I definitely want to do again. I had imagined, I think a lot of the pleasure of the films is this kind of like, as soon as one image leaves, another one comes, and it has this kind of epic pace that we've kind of become addicted to. Like, most of us can't even just sit down and watch something without having something else playing, or
Yes.
texting someone or whatever. So I really wanted to kind of recreate a live version of that, of the feeling that like things just keep coming and accumulating, and that we don't have time to consider what they might actually mean or be doing to us, or what this accumulation of materials is going to amount to, if anything. So the performance is structured. It has a conveyor belt that comes down through the audience, and then it has cameras over the conveyor belt. So it's kind of showing each object or image as it comes into the scene, and there's a pre-recorded voiceover that describes it as it comes in, which sort of half worked and half didn't. And I think that was something that was both like terrifying and exciting about doing it live, was that you
There's
can't
less
control.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure you can tell, like, my videos are a lot about like controlling exactly when everything happens. So yeah, it was yeah, I mean, it was actually really freeing in that way, but I had imagined like practicing it for a year before I did it, and that didn't happen. In fact, I think I practiced it once before the first performance. I mean, I spent a long time on it, but we just never got to practice the whole thing together. So in the end, it was also kind of about like trying and failing to organize materials, which I thought was actually a really nice part of it. It was also supposed to take place in the old empty Century 21 store, which
down by the World Trade Center site. That one. Wow.
Yeah, which is why it's called Down at the Arcade. Originally, I guess. I think I was very stressed out with making the piece and didn't really think too much about the title, but I think it was originally supposed to be, yeah, down on Wall Street, and it was supposed to be in this kind of obsolete, like, the department store replaced the mom and pop store, and then the internet replaced the department store, and it was supposed to kind of be this accumulation of stuff that nobody really wants or knows what to do with within that context. And then in the end, it was in a Topshop, which I think also works conceptually, although I
Because
had
Topshop
been
arrived and then it imploded in the States. Like it did,
exactly, yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
And it
And
was also
Topshop's just so ugly.
never bought anything. Sorry, Topshop. Never bought anything from there. But you also, I think, considered the former Barney's as a site as well for this performance. But then it became
Yeah,
like art something,
it became
like a
oh
WeWork
my
for
God.
art.
Yeah, it became this kind of like rental space for art fair booths or something, but within a kind of other art world. And then it also became, before that, one of those pop-up Halloween stores.
No.
So I wasn't able to use Barney's. But yeah, I have shot some footage in Barney's, and also in the Neiman Marcus that popped up for a few months on the west side of Manhattan and then immediately closed. And yeah, I've been really into filming in those kind of spaces as they're about to be closed, because like so much effort goes into kind of building these structures around selling clothes, and then you can really see how kind of false and constructed it all is once you're in there, and there's like a 90% off sign on everything, and the lighting has been half turned off, and
Yeah. It's always framed as the end of an era. I mean, how important Barney's was, in the cultural imagination in New York. And,
yeah.
it's one thing in the cycle of all things. So let's talk about Glass Life, which is the major work that's in the exhibition. It's a 6-channel video installation. It's your most ambitious production to date. We're very thrilled to be able to present it at ICALA. It's been really fun having the work on site. And it comes from, the term Glass Life comes from a passage in the Shoshana Zuboff book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, which hints on the pervasiveness of data and technology, convenience industries, and the slow erosion of privacy and agency. In an interview that I read with you, the term Glass Life was appealing to you because it spoke to the fragility of life and the attachment to things that keep us going through time, even in the constant glut of images and the lessening of our privacy and agency as a result of burgeoning technologies. And this idea of transparency comes into play. Like when you think about glass, you think about transparency. And transparency is evident in certain aspects of your work, the credits that feature all the persons cited or who influenced the work, the layering of images and the revealing of the apparatus of the studio. But there's also a degree of opacity in the work, particularly in the use of theory. And you spoke about this a bit earlier, about this idea of misunderstanding. And I wanted to ask you about, at some point you said that you came to terms with your understanding of theory, and you set your own rules of engagement for using theory. And I want to know, how generative do you find the space of misunderstanding and opacity in the work, and what does that lend to the viewing experience?
Yeah, I mean, I find it very generative to kind of misunderstand something because you want to connect it to something else, and then to keep those things connected anyway. I mean, I think that's what everybody does to some degree. Or like, I think I mentioned at the beginning, kind of filtering the world through the lenses that we already have, or kind of seeing the parts that we want to see. And I think I approach theory kind of in the same way, like taking what I want to take and leaving the rest. Or I also think all of my work is kind of like pushing against these things that are maybe have like structures built around them to make them less accessible, and just being like, well, I can do whatever I want with this. Or I think like theory was initially so freeing for me to find as like, as a common experience. You're like, oh, these people have already talked about this thing that I knew but couldn't articulate. But then you sort of start to realize, for one thing, that a lot of people are just saying the same thing over and over again, and that it kind of becomes this like myopic exercise in finding new ways to say the same thing, which was something that also kind of interested me about it, like the privileging of it, and then sort of the disillusionment with it that I experienced at some point. So my terms for using theory kind of became just about not caring about the parts that I didn't understand, and then taking what's useful for me, which I guess is also kind of my approach to feminism. Like, or maybe a more current reading of feminism is like taking the parts of what are prescribed ways of being a woman in the world, or however you want to describe it, the things that you're supposed to do, like taking the ones that are useful and leaving the rest, and like not having to have such a strict relationship to these things that are so loaded and hard to navigate in our actual lives. And yeah, and then I was also thinking, and I think I've talked about this before in other talks, but about how theory kind of becomes the same, used in the same way as kitsch images, and gets kind of turned over and over again until it doesn't really mean anything, and kind of excludes so much of the actual world in order to make its point. And yeah, Glass Life and Red Film both sort of use theory in that way, and kind of don't allow it to make the point that it's trying to make, but rather absorb it into another structure so that it means something else.
Yeah, I mean, because there is so much that goes into it, and there's, voices, narration, there's all these texts, there's parts that might be familiar to some audiences and not to others. There's this disorientation that is a part of the work. When you're entering into the space, you can't see everything at once, you can't hear everything at once, and there is a certain aspect of legibility, not just in the use of theory that may or may not mean anything, or this recycling of theory to the point where, who knows what's being said because it's been said before. But it also forces you to slow down a bit as a viewer when encountering the work, to try to understand or wade through the density of images, sounds, and citations. So I wanted to ask about the strategy of replicating the information deluge of the everyday in this work, the doom scroll, or as a writer for tech once referred to it as the phenomenology of the feed, the archive of images, voices, etc. Like, how does it work for you to kind of replicate this experience, but also create a different experience at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I felt all the same stress replicating it that I would feel experiencing it, in a way. Like it, my hope for the film was that it has this feeling that like there's always too much, and that you can never get to the end, and that the structure of the film is that you're kind of scrolling down a plane that was built in the studio, that's an actual like layered set with glass planes and images on it, and then you keep kind of zooming into these other worlds, and every time you kind of settle into one world, it opens onto another, and that's actually the feeling I have kind of making these works. Like there's always 20 other ways it could go, and actually I should say, like, even being sort of dismissive of theory, I like do really try to make it make sense in some really long version, and then everything gets cut out in the final one, and it becomes this kind of much more opaque thing that it actually is at the end. Like if you read the full version, I think there would be more of a kind of narrative or something, or things would connect more. But like you said, like it's not really what it's supposed to be, because I think the opacity and the kind of, I think it's more about like the structure of what seems important in a sense than it is about the actual content, although a lot of the actual content like talks about what it feels like to live in this world and how confusing it is to have so much information and how slippery truth has become, and all sorts of other kind of topics around that. But no actual individual line is supposed to be that important, which is what it feels like also sometimes to live in the world right now, or like these epically important things will happen and it's hard to kind of separate them from the next thing that
Yeah, it
comes
gets
in.
shuttled in and then it gets discarded. It's a constant cycle of information. I mean, we can't ignore that this work was made in the context of the pandemic. So, you know,
Yeah.
thinking about this cycling of information and where we are now in 2022, where we're allegedly post-pandemic, which is not true at all. But, you know, this moving away of certain information to privilege other information, it's this kind of unending circuit.
hmm Yeah, I mean, or like what we don't want to think about anymore, like the pandemic, or I mean, because one of my first job when I moved to New York was working at the New York Times, and I was like so shocked by how arbitrary the news is, and I didn't even work in the newsroom, but and I'm still like, you know, that sense where you actually, when every once in a while you know about the thing that the news is talking about and you suddenly realize that it's not the way it actually happened. I have this experience every time they write about Canada on the New York Times in this kind of like quaint, oh, they're so funny and nice up there way that's like not really how it is at all. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess it sounds kind of conspiratorial, but like you just realize how all of those structures are serving their bottom line. And of course, everyone talks about that all the time. But the film was kind of also just trying to get at like another thing that was talked about a lot during the pandemic and during the Trump years, how these kind of like institutions that we used to think meant something for better or worse no longer seem to mean anything, and how there's a freedom in that, and then also like a lack of knowing where to place your like hopes and your what you believe in, I guess. So and
There's a sense of instability
yeah,
where things seem stable and then they aren't, and then they firm up again, and then it's just constantly back and forth.
yeah, and I think it's like a real pandemic artwork. Like it's so obsessive. I look at other works that were made in the pandemic and I feel like I can tell sometimes like when every part of it, I think there's a lot of work that we'll look back on and see that like every corner of a painting was finished, or every section of a film was like timed so intensely in ways that it might not have been before. And I think like a lot of artists, and I'm sure everyone in different ways, like put their energy into these kind of very specific obsessive spaces, and that not just my film but a lot of work from that period will kind of look like it's of that period later, and like it's talking about that kind of overwhelming amount of information that's only coming to you through a screen, and what that does to your sense of self and your sense of where you are in the world.
Yeah, and being witness to something from a distance where it feels immediate because you're looking at it on a screen, be it your television or your phone, but it's still quite distant.
Yeah, that was just so strange, and remains strange. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. And also just like the way that I think we all saved so much material that we don't know what to do with now, or we kind of like like I also thought in Red Film about this idea of esquisses, like that and it's mentioned in one line. It's like one of those lines that skims past so fast, but actually if you open it up, it has a lot of other meanings. It's about kind of stepping back from the world in order to re-enter it more ethically, or to like step back and be able to see more clearly when you get back into it. And both Red Film and Glass Life are sort of about like being unable to do that anymore, or I mean, it's kind of this ironic space within the pandemic because it was like literally a stepping back, and yet we almost stepped forward into even more and more stuff. And that contradiction, I think, was really confusing and painful for a lot of people, including myself. So the film kind of tries to also just like deal with this archive and the specific archive of that time mixed with what came before, and how kind of silly that or irrelevant some of that stuff seems.
We accept all these images as we accept the climate. Every search, click, and like is claimed as an asset. We don't mind. Listen, where were you in all this? From Walter B. to Kim K. No paradise like the past. Photography, phonography, the cinema, radio, television, video, and the internet have made ever greater quantities of memory potentially accessible. Will I be nostalgic for this time? Comparatively little attention has been devoted to what people forget, and why. In the glass life, everything can be used. It is all material. We are smooth as glass, frictionless, porous, sourceless. Where are you now? The sky is falling. Apple stock is rising. Look up at the sky, look down at the screen in your hands. And the scenes come together like congregations which gently join and slowly disperse or hang solemnly still. Virginia Woolf. Is this how the internet works? What is the weather doing? Question. Can an apple fall upwards?
My tongue swore to it, but my heart.
Our brains, he realized, will go to baroque lengths, do magic tricks even to preserve the integrity of our worldview. The more there is to know, the more we feel that truth is elusive. Deny, even if the truth is obvious. That's the playbook. Promiscuity between the seer and the seen. The body is a sheet of plain glass to see right through to the mind. Words should say exactly what they mean. Why do they betray us? To say that is to say this.
The bankers, the captains of industry,
everyone. The bankers, the captains of industry, the oil barons. Tulip bulbs of 17th century Holland which generated a wild speculative rush that quickly disappeared, leaving behind nothing but flowers. Will I be nostalgic for this time? Berenice Abbott said, I have tried to be objective. What I mean by objectivity is not the objectivity of a machine, but of a sensible human being with the mystery of personal selection at the heart of it. She kind of invented the bird's eye view, accidental mother of surveillance technology, whatever. Between the here and now of lived experience and the ideal is a distance which creates and maintains desire. And we know that in love, the reach exceeds the grasp. This photograph says, I am happy. This one says, I am free. We appear to be both obsessive documenters of our experience, yet largely indifferent to or overwhelmed by the There was a before time, and there will be an after time. We return nowhere. Between life and death, we become other than ourselves. I want my shelf life to be long. Life points beyond itself. Or does it? He says the word image is in bad repute because we have thoughtlessly believed that a drawing was a tracing, a copy, a second thing. Distorted dream symbol. Dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. The first modernity suppressed the growth and expression of self in favor of collective solutions. But by the second modernity, too many people have come to feel excluded from the future. You can have any color car you want, so long as it's Henry Ford, year 1909. The alienation is real. Surfeit of weak ties suffocates stronger bonds seem available only through the online tools that have diminished them. The will to remain alive which drives all humans forward. How constant surveillance robs us of the will. The life-sustaining inwardness born in sanctuary finally distinguishes us from the machine. As recalcitrant users, we will not be obstacles. Still dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good.
No one will need to be good.
I want to, in closing, talk about, these images, this archive of images, some of which are maybe difficult, or you're still in the active processing it or trying to figure out how to incorporate it. So I wanted to know, what is the place of difficult images in your work? I mean, there are some images in Last Life that might evoke certain feelings for some people, like the footage from the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. You know, those are challenging images because of all the things that are conjured up as a result of knowing what those protests were about. So yeah, I'd like to know for you, like what are the stakes in difficult images in your work, and how do you work with those?
Yeah, I mean, Glass Life was kind of terrifying to make because I have often used older images that I can sort of see more clearly what they're doing. And I guess, and then actually the footage from the protest, I kept taking in and putting out, taking out and putting in and taking in and putting out. And I couldn't decide, like, could you make this film without acknowledging that these things were happening, or does it feel like it's just kind of virtue signaling or like annoying? And then the film was also kind of about like the commodification of politics and how kind of everything had become absorbed into these cycles, and how much like how kitsch works, we were kind of all hiding behind like posting things but not actually doing anything, or how kind of like smaller forms of action that might just include posting something on Instagram can kind of replace real meaningful change. And that applies to a lot of things, but seemed especially potent at that time. So yeah, that was actually, yeah, difficult images. I mean, it stresses me out so much to kind of wade into the present, but I felt in that film that I sort of had to acknowledge the outside world to some degree, and the kind of absolutely like unprecedented things that were happening, or not unprecedented, but you know, that we had never experienced anything like that, and then we're trying to make meaning of it through a screen. And yeah, but
How possible that is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there are other images in, like, even using a picture of Kim Kardashian, I was like, do I need her in here? I don't know, but it does feel like it like she also says so much about this current moment, and the kind of like I think her image in there functions in a sort of different section about the kind of like dovetailing of aesthetics, and the way that everyone is kind of starting to look the same, or as Gia Tolentino talks about so amazingly, like an Instagram, or like everyone kind of starts to have similar features, and how crazy that is. And that's just like one tiny aspect of this larger conversation about kind of figuring out what a self means within these online worlds.
Sarah, it's been such a pleasure to work with you on this exhibition and to show your work in Los Angeles. I know that the show has been very well received and people are very excited about this body of work. So congratulations again to you. Just posted. Stay tuned. Very excited to see what comes of your residency in Los Angeles and your upcoming show at Cooper Cole in Toronto. So congratulations on all things. And thank you everyone for tuning in for this talk. I'm Jamillah James. Good night.
Good night.